Pope Francis and the Vatican are cozying up to Muslims. Are they tossing the faith overboard in the process? Now with us, our Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomez. Hello.
Greetings from Rome, Brad.
What's going on here?
Brad, Pope Francis and the Vatican are taking a wrecking ball to centuries of authoritative Catholic papal teaching.
Now, exactly what are they doing?
There were 3 papal bulls issued in the 15th century, and the Vatican has just declared that these bulls have been abrogated because they offend indigenous peoples. But more importantly, and they won't tell us this, they offend Muslims.
Exactly how do they offend Muslims?
Okay, let me break that down. These bulls were written in the context of aggression from Islamic forces against Christians. And Pope Nicholas V and Alexander VI, when they issued these bulls, I'll name them Dum Diversas from 1452, Romanus Pontifex from 1455, and Inter Cetera from 1493, they very specifically talked about the Saracens as infidels, as enemies of the cross of Christ. And they called upon Christian kings to stand against the forces of Islam and to unapologetically preach Christ and establish Christendom, or take back lands that had been conquered by Muslims.
Okay, well, Jules, why or how is the Vatican actually spinning this whole cancellation of these documents, this perennial teaching?
Well, now, Brad, this is the big story that none of the world's media have been able to understand. I mean, the secular media have run with the story, and they are basically buying the Vatican spin and claiming, along with the Vatican, that this has to do with the indigenous peoples. Yes, that is correct. That is one part of the story. But more importantly, and 2 renowned Islamic scholars and historians have confirmed this, it has to do with Pope Francis cozying up in that Mephistophelian deal in 2019 with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, and the Concordat that has led to so much of coming together between Francis and the Islamic world.
Exactly what have these Islamic historians brought to light?
Okay, I will quote from Raymond Ibrahim, author of The Sword and Scimitar. He says that these 3 bulls were designed to inspire Europeans to rise up and defend Christendom against Muslims. 2, he quotes now Romanus Pontifex, restrain the savage excesses of the Saracens and of other infidels, enemies of the Christian name. And then Ibrahim goes on to say, it is often forgotten that these Muslim lands, quote Muslim, were Christian centuries before Islam invaded and conquered them in the 7th century. The popes were well aware of this, and as such, these expeditions were seen as just wars, both to quell Muslim aggression, but also to return North Africa and the Middle East to Christendom.
Well, then, what you mentioned another historian. How did he weigh in?
Robert Spencer, who's written about 23 books on Islam and the Middle East, echoes Ibrahim, and he says that this business of dialogue with Islam is not really dialogue on Francis's part. He's deluding himself. It's totally one-sided, because Francis is giving and giving and giving to the Muslims, but getting nothing back in return, including the assurance that Christians in Muslim lands will not be persecuted.
Every day we're hearing about more and more persecution in places like Iran and Afghanistan. And all. I mean, you get killed just for being a Catholic and show your cross in public. What actually is the consensus, if we can kind of put it in a nutshell? What's the consensus going back to the 1500s with those 3 documents? and bringing it up to present day, the magisterium, if you will, of Pope Francis. How do those jive or not jive? Dial that in for us.
Well, before we talk about the consensus, Brad, it's important to note that it's not just these two Islamic scholars, but I was looking at a Brill publication. Brill is one of the best academic publications in the world. And in one volume on Muslim-Christian relations, volume 7, they actually name all three documents on all three papal bulls on a single page. And they stress the Islamic aspect of these three bulls. Now, that brings us, of course, to the consensus. And the consensus developed because in the first few decades after the death of Muhammad, and even while Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, was still alive, Christian lands were ravaged by Muslim armies. And so both the Crusades and these bulls issued by the popes were not only saying that first Islam is a false religion, but they were urging Christians to fight for their faith and for the protection of pilgrims, for example, who were going to the Holy Land and who were harassed by Muslim invaders. The consensus has radically changed because, and the best example, of course, is the Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi, which has just been inaugurated, which is a Catholic church, a Jewish synagogue, and a Muslim mosque.
Now, Jules, you were saying that the world is buying this spin on indigenous people and enculturation, all this hook, line, and sinker. Does anybody else, besides your reporting there, boots on the ground in the Vatican, is anybody else bringing out this whole Islamic angle with regard to nixing these three documents?
Absolutely nobody, not even the Wall Street Journal or, prestigious mainline publications. And I discovered this because I used to teach Islam. And funnily enough, the Brill publication that I quoted is edited by a colleague of mine who headed the Islamic Studies department at the university where I was teaching. But Francis himself has chimed in on this, and let me quote his words. He again does his spiel on indigenous people, and of course, as I said, there is a certain aspect of this because when he went to Canada, two people held up a poster, a banner, and said, "Rescind the doctrine of discovery." Now, this is the politically correct call this, and quite falsely in a sense, the doctrine of discovery, because they claim that these three papal bulls were used by the Portuguese, for example, to enforce their colonialism.
Now, Jules, I think that the idea that we're just taking the land, you're worried about the land or anything, that's even an aside here. We're actually talking about the Muslim people themselves and trying to actually bring them to actually get with Christ and his church in the way that Christ wanted to be with all people in that sense. So I think we really have to say that they weren't even anti-Muslim back in the day. They're actually pro-Muslim. They're trying to save souls.
They weren't even anti-Muslim, and more importantly, they forget that imperialism began with Islam. You have this hypothesis by the famous historian Ephraim Karsh in his book Islamic Imperialism. Let me quote Francis. Francis says, "Never again can the Christian community allow itself to be infected by the idea that one culture is superior to another, or that it is legitimate to employ ways of coercing others." So Francis here is buying into the left-wing historical trajectory that is now dominant in many universities.
All right, Jules. Well, good to have you on the phone here, and keep us updated on these stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad.